Well, almost every single mock draft that you look at right now has the Sacramento Kings taking Jaden Ivey with the 4th overall pick in the draft. But should Kings general manager Monte McNair really consider taking his 3rd straight guard in 3 straight drafts? And does Jaden Ivey fit with De'Aaron Fox? Here to answer some of those questions and give us a lot more context on Jaden Ivey is Purdue beat writer Mike Carmin. He joins me on today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. Looking forward to covering my 9th season of Sacramento Kings basketball. This is year 5 for me hosting the Locked On Kings podcast. I currently work for ABC 10 News in Sacramento. And like I said in the introduction, really the second that we saw the Kings end up with number 4, Jaden Ivey was the first name that came to so many people's mind, not just in Sacramento, but nationally. He's been considered that 4th pick really for quite a while when you look at mock drafts. So it's no surprise that a lot of teams have the Kings pegged to take Jaden Ivey. And while I still think there's a lot of value potentially in the Kings trading this draft pick, if they were to hold on to the pick, I think as of right now, the most likely scenario is the Kings taking Jaden Ivey and his tremendous upside, his athleticism, even though he would be yet another guard. But on today's Locked On King podcast, we're going to get to know and learn a little bit more about Jaden Ivey and what he was able to do in his 2 seasons at Purdue. Mike Carmin is going to be sharing with us what Jaden Ivey could look like playing off the ball next to De'Aaron Fox, what his skill sets are, his NBA comparisons, if he really truly is like Ja Morant. He's going to talk a little bit about Jaden Ivey's family, his background, and how that's helped him develop, and already the connections that he actually has with Ja Morant, plus any concerns that he might have about Ivey and things that Jaden Ivey needs to work on. We're covering all of this and more on today's Locked On Kings podcast. So if you're a Jaden Ivey fan, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Plus, at the very end of our conversation, there's an interesting tidbit about Keegan Murray, who's been brought up a lot in a comparison or a debate recently in Sacramento about if Keegan Murray would make sense for the Kings at 4, as he is maybe more of a better fit prospect for Sacramento. We discuss it all. I hope you enjoy it right here on Locked On Kings. From the second it was revealed that the Sacramento Kings had the 4th overall pick in the draft, Jaden Ivey has been the name connected with the Kings time and time again. Already the conversation is raging in Sacramento whether or not Jaden Ivey is the right guy to take, even though he would be the 3rd straight guard that the Kings took in 3 straight drafts, and De'Aaron Fox is still on this team. To give us a better idea, though, of who Jaden Ivey is the last 2 years that he spent with Purdue, joining me right now for the first time on Locked On Kings is Mike Carmin, covers Purdue sports for JC Online, the Journal and Courier. Mike, it is a pleasure to have you with me here on Locked On Kings. So appreciate you being willing to come on here and shed some light a little bit on this pride of Purdue that is going to be entering into the NBA draft here shortly.
Well, number one, thanks for reaching out. We'll determine at the end how much of a pleasure it was for you and your fans. But yes, happy to talk about Jaden and what he might add to the Kings in the NBA.
So first off, NBA comparisons and for prospects are always such a crapshoot. Like I've seen comparisons to Ja Morant, who's currently in Memphis. I've seen comparisons to Donovan Mitchell, who's in Utah. Both names that Sacramento would love to have a version of that on their roster. But when you watch Jaden Ivey play, is he unique? Does he remind you of any of those players listed? It remind you of any currently NBA guys or former NBA guys, or is he just very much a unique player?
No, I think Morant is the best comparison for him. I mean, when you stack those guys up and look at them just physically, they're roughly the same size. They have the same build. They do a lot of the same things. They're both very electric in the open court. Morant's probably a better outside shooter at this stage than Jaden is, but that will come with Jaden. But and the backstory on Morant is that a few years ago, Jaden's mom, Neil Ivey, who's now the head coach at Notre Dame, spent a year as an assistant coach with Memphis, and of course Jaden went to Memphis and hung out with his mom and Morant, and just tried to learn and absorb and soak up his daily routine, how he became a pro and all the things that he did off the court. So Jaden was already kind of preparing for his NBA career a few years ago, just to kind of get an idea of what it takes to play at that level, play at a high level, what the things you have to do, not on the court necessarily, but how do you take care of yourself off the court? How do you prepare yourself on the off day? All that kind of stuff. And I think that period of time was very valuable to Jaden to help him kind of grow at the college level, but also prepare him for what's about to happen, regardless of what team he goes to in the NBA. So I think that was very helpful for him. And of course, he has a tremendous basketball background with his mom. She played for the Indiana Fever back in the day, and he's been around basketball his life, and always in the gym, always doing things basketball related. So Morant's probably the best comparison out there right now. And if that holds true for Jaden, then obviously he'll have a tremendous career.
Sometimes scouts hold players who have spent multiple years in college against a player because they're a tiny bit older entering the draft than if you just come out your freshman year. But I also think that in the case of, like, the Kings drafted Davion Mitchell, and he was ready to make some sort of an immediate impact with the Kings from day one because of the extra time that he spent in college. How NBA ready do you think Jaden Ivey is to make an immediate impact? Because the Kings are looking for someone who can help them come in and not necessarily be a starter day one, although that would be phenomenal, but someone who can affect winning and get this team to the playoffs right away.
Well, that's an interesting question because he had a really good career in his 2 years at Purdue, and depending on who you talk to, he could use another year, or he's ready. He's ready to go right now, type of things. There are still elements of his game that still need a lot of work. Like he did improve his outside shooting from year one to year two. He still struggles a little bit with taking care of the basketball, especially when he gets in the lane. Some of his decision-making in a crowded area like the lane, needs to be better. But for all that, he's about an electrical player with the basketball in his hands that I've seen in a long time. And he's just so fast. You don't need him to run a 100-yard dash, but if he's doing it with a basketball in his hand, he's probably going to win. He's got that kind of athleticism. He's got that kind of speed. He's got such quick change of direction and things like that. Now, how ready is he to step into an NBA team, be a starter from the get-go, and help carry a team? That's kind of maybe out of my I don't have many expertise, but that's probably out of my wheelhouse a little bit. But he could come in and contribute. He's going to be a factor. He's going to make an impact in his first year, and a lot of it may just depend who's around him, how much he has to do. There were times in college where he felt like he needed to put the whole team on his back and do everything. I don't think you can do that in the NBA, especially as a rookie. In the potential situation that he might be in with a team that's trying to get itself going, trying to get back into the mix type of thing. But maybe Sacramento needs a player like that. Maybe other teams need a player like that. He certainly can do that, but I also think at the NBA level he's probably going to have to grow into that a little bit. But he has all the tools. He has all the intangible things that you would want. But there's just certain skills and areas of his game that he still needs to improve and work on.
You brought up his speed. I know Kings fans have daydreamed about the idea of he and De'Aaron Fox running in transition together. There might not be anybody else in the league that could catch the two of them when they get out in transition. But you see Jaden Ivey's name brought up, and on most like websites, scouting reports, he's listed as a point guard and less of a shooting guard. And while I think there is the possibility to where long term he and Fox could share that role, the Kings are coming off of a season where they had Tyrese Halliburton and Fox playing together, and Fox didn't look too good when he was not that primary ball handler. So how do you feel Jaden's game could translate to being more off ball and kind of being the second fiddle as a ball handler to someone like De'Aaron?
That's interesting because, you know, at Purdue, and there were a lot of games this year where he dictated the outcome of the game with his passing. I think early in the season against North Carolina at a tournament out in Connecticut, also against Villanova in that same tournament, he affected the game with his passing a little bit more than his scoring, because he's at his best, like a lot of players at his level, when he's kind of out in transition and before he gets to the lane and making a decision that way, whether he's going straight to the basket or he's got some shooters on the wings or the corners. You know, in the college game, they had to defend him all the way from baseline to baseline, where, you know, maybe in the pros they don't do that, but he can affect the game and impact the game with his passing. So, you know, just getting the ball in his hands as much as possible, I think, would be a key for him. But I also think that he can, you know, he played off guard in college a lot. He was kind of their pseudo point guard. The one thing that I never kept track of that I wanted to, was like when he got a defensive rebound, he became the point guard for Purdue. And I always wanted to go back and chart how many times did Purdue score when he started his own fast break. And I think that's a big asset of his, that he can just get the ball and go. And if there are other players down there ready to shoot, ready to get into the offense, I think he can do that. I would see him playing the 1 and the 2 a lot. You know, maybe the 1 when you're trying to get out in transition, but the 2 if you're running more half court sets, you know, him coming off ball screens and stuff like that. So I think his versatility will give whoever takes him a lot of options there.
Quick pause here as I tell you about a great sponsor of the Locked On Kings podcast. I'm talking about Built Bar, and they have a brand new brownie batter puff for you to try. If you don't know what the puffs are, they're protein-infused marshmallows. This one, brownie batter flavored. And I love brownies, but you know what I love more? Brownie batter. It's better to eat, you know, with the spatula out of the bowl, that brownie batter, than it is once the brownies are actually cooked up, unless you're putting some, or I should say baked up, but unless you're putting some ice cream on top of them. But the best part about these brownie batter puffs is the fact that not only are they delicious, not only do they satisfy that sweet tooth, they are healthy for you. 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, only 7 grams of sugar. These things are delicious. They knock regular brownies and other sweets out of the park. Pair that with the amazing Built bars that the Built Bar has, with their protein bars covered in 100% chocolate. Amazing flavors like coconut almond. My favorite is mint chocolate chip. They have just so many good ones for you to try. Whatever you try, whether it's a puff, a bar, go and use our promo code LOCKED15 at built.com to get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off at built.com. He made some pretty significant jumps statistically from his freshman season to his sophomore season, scoring going from 11 points to 17 points, games going from 23 games to 36 games, minutes up around 7 per game. His 3-point shooting percentage went way up from 25% to 35%. What were the biggest differences that you noticed? Was it just a bigger role for him, or did he look like a more polished player just between freshman and sophomore year? Like, what was the biggest difference that you noticed with his game in between those two seasons?
Well, probably just more of a polished player. And here's a guy that will work. I mean, he will work. It's not just lip service. I've seen him work. I've seen him come out after games, especially last year during COVID. Once he was done with whatever obligations he had after the game, he said goodbye to his mom. He was out on the court, putting up shots, he would bring a chair out occasionally and do drills that way. Now, he could have been doing it for show because, the media at that time could not get down any closer than what we were. So we were working upstairs. So he could have been doing it for show, but knowing his work ethic, knowing how he approaches the game and how he's always approached the game, that it probably wasn't for show. But I just think the off-season work, understanding what he needed to work on and really honing in on those drills and those skills to improve, kind of made him a better all-around player. And, the first year as a freshman, it was all kind of just like the rookie season for him. It's all going to be new. So you figure out, what you can do, what you can't do, what do you need to work on. And I just think in year 2 at Purdue, he was much more comfortable. And he's also surrounded by a really good team with 2 talented big men, and then some other guards that could shoot lights out. Yes, teams doubled him. Teams tried to get the ball out of his hands, but he wasn't the only scorer on the team. He wasn't the only player on the team. So he was able to get free a few times because of that. And it just kind of opened up his game. But I think his 3-point shooting percentage took a big jump. Mm-hmm. Some other things took a big jump. And, Purdue centered more of its offense around him in year 2 than maybe it did in year 1, because you're just trying to, in year 1, you kind of know what you got, but you don't really know what you got. And then from the middle of year 1, in the middle of the season, he was more of a starter, more of an active player. And then year 2, he was starting from the get-go. But Purdue centered its offense around him a lot more, and that could add to the increased production right there.
Yeah, his 3-point shooting feels like it's going to be key if he were to be the pick for Sacramento, and if he were to have a future in Sacramento next to Fox as more of a off-ball player. That leap you talked about, 3-point percentage going from 25% to 35%, rounded up to 36%. What's nice to see is that percentage went up, but also his 3-point attempts went up. They didn't go up because he was shooting less and making just a little bit more. He was making more and shooting more. Did you notice anything specifically that looked different with his shot going from year to year? Was it just falling more? Was he more catch and shoot, more shooting off the dribble? Like, what stood out to you, if anything, about that jump shot leap that he had?
It's just, he did it more, and he was more comfortable doing it. There were times when he shouldn't have shot, but he did. He would dribble down. I mean, there were games, and players do this all the time, I know. But there were games where he was just trying to get in the game. And by getting in the game, if I got to launch a 30-footer to get me into the game, that's what Jaden's going to do. It wasn't an every possession thing, but you could probably go back once a game at least. He'd dribble across half court and just let it fly. And if he made it, great. If not, Purdue kind of chalked it up to a turnover. But I feel like at times he needed to do that just for his own just kind of his own getting into the game type of thing. And players approach that differently. I mean, he understands at the NBA level that his 3-point shot is going to be key because, teams are going to back off of him. I mean, if you tried to guard him close in college, he was just going to blow right by you, or he was going to use a screen from one of the big guys to get in the lane and do his business. So it's going to be a constant theme for him, being able to consistently hit from 3-point line. And it's not going to all happen at once. But once he does that, and he is that threat, then I think the whole game opens up for him at that point, because you have to respect everything about his game at that point and not just playing for the dribble. You're going to have to play him for a 3-point shot as well.
Mike, the Kings have been dreadful for so long defensively, and their backcourt defensively has been a lot of that problem over the years. Jaden Ivey's his possibility as a defensive prospect, what he can do on that side of the ball. He's known for this explosiveness and athleticism and the offensive firepower that he can provide. But did you notice anything with him as a defender that you think could translate well to the NBA, or that could make him not necessarily a great defender, but competent enough to have significant minutes at the NBA level?
I think he could be a great defender if he puts his mind to it. And Purdue needed him to be a better defender last season. Anybody that knows anything, and probably people watching this don't know a whole lot about Purdue basketball, but they pride themselves on defense, and that's something they lacked this year. Even though they had an extremely talented team, they were not one of the better defensive teams under Matt Painter, which was kind of a sore point for them. They were great offensively, but struggled in a lot of games defensively. And I always felt like Jaden could rectify that by being the alpha dog that they needed on the defensive end. And as most people know, defense takes no skill. It's a mindset. It's a want to. And he got a lot of steals and stuff like that. But a lot of defense is just more defending your man and
right.
You're making it difficult for them. I think he can be. I think he can be that guy, and maybe getting in the pros will bring that more out of him. I think there's a lot more to give defensively that he can bring to a team. But I would also say that fans that are buying tickets are not coming to watch him play defense. They're watching him for the high flying dunks and the baseline to baseline plays. But it's an element of his game that's there. I think it just needs to be brought out, and maybe it'll just be situational, and he'll be able to succeed that way.
The upside is definitely there, and there's no doubt in my mind that he deserves to be at the top of the draft. But Mike, are there any risks you think to him being drafted that high, or to a team putting too much stock into him or too much hope into him? Any risks that come to mind, or do you think he's a pretty, not necessarily safe player, but you can take him with confidence?
No, I think you can take him with confidence. I think with any player that young, and there's a whole bunch of them in the draft this year, and there's a whole bunch of them in the draft every year. You kind of think you know what you're getting, but you don't know until they actually get there and play games. He did have a high abundance at times of turnovers. And his outside shot is not where it needs to be consistently. His last game against St. Peter's in the NCAA tournament, for whatever reason, St. Peter's got in his head, and he couldn't get him out of it. And he played probably his worst game of his career in his last game. So he is a mentally strong kid. I think his mom has really helped him in that area. But when Purdue needed him to rise up in that game and kind of put what St. Peter's was doing to him on the back burner, it didn't happen. But as I mentioned, there's going to be risk anytime.
Yeah.
There's probably a place like Sacramento for Jaden Ivey probably doesn't bring a lot of pressure, because while people will have high expectations for him, it's not like if the Pacers took him, or Detroit, where he's probably more of a name in our neck of the woods as opposed to Sacramento. But if you're the 4th overall pick in the NBA draft, there's a high level of expectation that comes with that. So I think he'll handle it well. I think eventually all the things that he's done to prepare for this moment, and I think, as I said at the beginning, hanging around Morant, hanging around Memphis, I think really will prepare him for his career in the NBA.
This episode of Locked On Kings is also brought to you by BetOnline, our title sponsor of today's podcast. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the #1 source for all your betting needs and sports information. Right now, you can bet on fun things like where DeAndre Ayton is going to end up. They have where Russell Westbrook is going to end up. And I think the Kings are 9-1 odds that Russell Westbrook becomes a Sacramento King. God, I hope not. You can even bet on who you think the Sacramento Kings are going to take with the 4th overall pick, as well as a lot of great stuff around the draft. Of course, NBA playoffs as well. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next season's NFL futures. All on BetOnline right now. They're your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action at BetOnline, where the game starts. Last thing that I got for you, Mike, I don't know how familiar you are with the absolute top of this draft. It sounds like the three of Chet Holmgren, Jabari Smith, Paulo Banchero, those are kind of set in stone, although I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility at all for one of those three to slide to the Kings at 4. And maybe that's because Jaden Ivey works his way into the top 3 and it impresses one of those 3 teams enough. Is it realistic in your mind, based off of what you know of Jaden Ivey, to say, yeah, he's good enough to surprise some people and jump up a couple spots? Do you think that's a realistic scenario, or do you think 4 and maybe lower is pretty comfortable for him?
Well, I think the number one thing is need. What do those 3 teams need? Is there a can't miss prospect in this draft among those top 3? They seem to be the consensus of what those 3 teams would pick, and I don't think any team is begging to say, well, we got to have this guy or that guy. I think if any one of those, or obviously Orlando's going to start things off in what they do, and that will dictate how the rest of the draft goes. But as a trade here, a trade there, maybe Keegan Murray from Iowa steps up, and he's a fabulous player. He really was. Keegan Murray would have been Big Ten Player of the Year. He was the Big Ten Player of the Year at the end of the year. Johnny Davis was the Big Ten Player of the Year for most of the year. But Keegan Murray really came on late. He's a guy that I know the draft projections have him probably in the 7 or 8 range, but I could see him jumping up and jumping over a Jaden Ivey or jumping over somebody else because a team really likes what he brings. But I don't know if, taking Jaden 2 or 3 might be a little bit of a reach for a team, but I don't know if there's that much separation between those top guys, even when you get down to the top 10. So that's why I say it's based on need. If you need a big man, you got to take a big man. If you fall in love with Chet Holmgren's skill set, then that's what you do. And taking a guy from Duke is always probably not a can't miss, but they don't miss very often. So I'd be a little surprised if he jumped into the top 3, but I do know the Pacers would love to have him. And I'm curious if the Pacers will try to move up in any form, because it would really jumpstart their franchise, and it would really create a buzz around the Pacers that they desperately need. They really, it's kind of a forgotten franchise in the NBA in some respects because of their just kind of lack of success here recently. But so I'm really curious how they approach the draft, or if they're going to stand pat and wait to see who falls to them at number 6.
It's fascinating, Mike, that you brought up Keegan Murray, because that's really the debate. That's the discussion happening in Sacramento right now, because a lot of what the Kings are looking for this offseason, at least in my opinion, is they're looking for immediate impact players that can help this team make the playoffs. Essentially, they have 2 years with Domantas Sabonis' contract. They have 2 years to win and convince him to stay. If he leaves, then they traded Tyrese Halliburton to Indiana, essentially for nothing. So during those 2 years, they're looking for players that are going to come in and theoretically fit next to Sabonis, fit next to De'Aaron Fox, and get them there. And when you look at fit for what the Kings are trying to get, Keegan Murray checks a lot of boxes as a floor spacer, as a defender, plugs that 4 hole for the Kings. He makes a whole lot of sense, but there are a lot of people that believe that he is maybe a tier below Jaden Ivey. So it's really fascinating for you to bring that up unprompted, because I think that's really going to be the debate and discussion among Sacramento Kings fans, and maybe even the Sacramento Kings front office over the next month until draft night.
Well, are you going to draft the best athlete, or are you going to draft the best basketball player? Ideally, you draft both.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Jaden Ivey gives you the athletic ability and a lot of the athletic skills. And not that Keegan Murray's not athletic, but he's kind of a different kind of player than Jaden Ivey. Doesn't always have the ball in his hands like Jaden probably would. But as you said, how does whoever they draft, how does that fit with their current roster? Who can get the most? Can the current players help get the most out of your first round draft pick? And I don't think you can go wrong with Keegan Murray or Jaden Ivey. Just a matter of how the front office sees the need. and who can get them there the quickest. Both would be excellent picks. Both would do the franchise proud. But it's a tough choice. I don't. That would be a hard choice to make, but that's why those guys are paid a lot of money to make those choices, to make those evaluations. But Keegan Murray would not be a bad pick at all. He would be a tremendous pick for anyone, and I wouldn't be surprised if he leapfrogs a couple guys in this draft.
Huge thank you to Mike for joining me here, making his Locked On Kings podcast debut. I thought it was really interesting there at the end that unprompted, he brought up Keegan Murray and how much he likes Keegan Murray. And it's fitting based off the conversations that we've been having here in Sacramento. Jaden Ivey, Keegan Murray. Ivey considered to be higher ceiling and more of the best player available. Keegan Murray, also a really good player that is a phenomenal fit in Sacramento. And to hear Mike talk about how high he actually has Keegan Murray, how good of a player he thinks Keegan Murray is, maybe the gap between Jaden Ivey and Keegan Murray isn't that big. And that's coming from someone who's watched Jaden Ivey and covered Jaden Ivey's entire college career at Purdue. I really thought that was interesting. So if you want to respond to that, weigh in on that. If you want to weigh in on anything that Mike and I discussed, you want to talk about Jaden Ivey and his potential fit with De'Aaron Fox, or do you not even care? Are you to the point where it's like you just take the best player, and if Jaden Ivey ends up being a better player than De'Aaron, you move on from De'Aaron at this point? Or if De'Aaron and Ivey don't work together, but Ivey shows tremendous upside, it's De'Aaron that has to go this time. If that's where you're at, let me know. At Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. And make sure you join me on tomorrow's Locked On Kings podcast. Yeah, a Saturday episode of Locked On Kings. I'm going to be joined by Kennington Lloyd Smith III. He is a beat writer that covers Iowa basketball and who's covered Keegan Murray in his career in Iowa. And he's going to have a lot of great things to say about Keegan. Honestly, as of right now, and especially after doing these two interviews, I am not heavily leaning, but I'm still in the Keegan Murray camp over Jaden Ivey. You might think I'm a fool because of that, leaning more fit instead of best player available. I honestly don't know if Jaden Ivey is the best player or that much better than Keegan Murray, when all things are said and done, but I could be wrong there. What do we know? They haven't played in the second in the NBA yet, but this is fun conversation to have, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode and all future episodes. Remember, we're doing a Locked On Kings giveaway right now. If you help get Locked On Kings to over 350 reviews on Apple Podcasts, we're at like 300 or 301 right now. If we get over 350, I will be buying a pair of opening night tickets to the Kings home opener this season. I will be giving them away to a Locked On Kings listener. So please help me do that. If you don't have an account, it takes like 2 seconds. Just go and create an account there, hit 5 stars. There's a little box where you can leave a custom review, what you like about Locked On Kings, why to encourage others to listen to Locked On Kings. Really helps out the show a ton. And again, we get over 350, I will be buying a pair of opening night tickets and giving them away. So please help me out with that. I really would appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Locked On Kings. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.